pride and pleasure to present to you our Undersecretary of Education, the Honorable Dr. Victor Ordonez, who will present to us the educational environment for values education and analysis. Dr. Ordonez, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bautista. Honorable Secretary Lourdes Quisumbing, fellow sculptors, to use Director Rosas' words, of the citizens and leaders of tomorrow, friends, good afternoon. I have a confession to make. I asked to speak at this Congress. I know this is unusual since speaking engagements are things I generally try to avoid rather than seek out. But I have had for some time a compelling urge to speak out and share my growing uneasiness about the lethargic inertia of Philippine education, and to thus force myself to articulate this uneasiness. This sense began with my first long reflective period away from the daily chores of my desk during the UNESCO conference in Paris, and has recurred and intensified since then every time the future directions of our country were discussed in either national or international gatherings. Where is our country going, and what are the educators doing about it? If our country is, or should be, going in fundamentally different directions, why is the educational system still complacently going in the same fundamental direction? There is a second reason that compels me to speak to you today. Besides the fundamental importance of the topic, that is the fundamental importance of the audience. I have shared my thoughts in bits and pieces with various friends, discussion groups, commencement audiences, and scholars. And as I recall the parable of the sower who cast his seed on hard ground among thorns and among weeds, I realize that before me I have fertile ground with a real potential for the proverbial hundredfold. And that if my thoughts are to affect, however modestly, the directions of Philippine education, there can be no better audience than you, superintendents, state college heads, private school and other association leaders. My topic for today is an environmental analysis for the values education framework. And there can be no more appropriate vehicle for my message than this topic. The importance of this framework has already been eloquently emphasized by our Secretary, and I can only echo my support, for I too recognize that, as Dex Order number 6 itself says, and I quote, "The changes brought about by the new expectations for real freedom and democracy and the emergence of opportunities for the citizens to participate in social transformation and nation building all demand a corresponding reassessment in the values, attitudes, and behaviors of the people," unquote. In fact, if this trust can be properly translated into programs to transform the educational output of the system in the way it is designed, this could well be the landmark achievement of the Quisumbing administration. I realize, of course, that the chasm that separates the theoretical design and the desired actual change in society is enormous, and it must be bridged. Two things are necessary to bridge this. First, although already corrected, perfected, and refined by years of consultations, and probably as perfect as possible as far as content is concerned, the framework must still be translated into simpler, shorter packages. I am reminded of a previous French Prime Minister who, upon being presented with a blueprint for French economic recovery after the war, said, and I quote, "This is too intelligent. Stupefy it and condense it into 5 pages. Unless 75% of my people can understand it, it is useless," unquote. Similarly, the vast Chinese nation has been led during this century through the most radical societal changes, for better or for worse. And the visions for these changes were never in intellectual volumes of political theory, but always captured for the masses in short, catchy slogans. The peasant on center stage. Or even today they keep using open door policy, or one nation, two systems, or 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and so forth. So this values framework, which even I have a hard time understanding, must be similarly repackaged into a level and a style that is crystal clear to every grade school teacher. And you know realistically what that level is. Second, there is a need to particularize and localize the general framework, which is theoretically a generic schema useful to all times and all places. In fact, this is described in Dex Order 6 itself, and I quote, "The values chart provides flexibility for regions, divisions, or schools in determining their priorities and in making decisions on whether other values have to be added to meet the needs in their specific localities," unquote. The document further states, again I quote, "It is desirable that regions, localities, and institutions construct their own values map with clearly defined priorities suited to their peculiar context and needs," unquote. I would today like to take up that challenge and try to draw from the general values map a values map specific to the Philippines in 1988. The prescription calls for all of us taking the universal timeless framework and applying it to local times and communities. I hope I can urge and help you along by providing you a current national values framework as a halfway house in your journey from the universal values framework of Dex Order 6, which you have, and the local community values framework, which you are supposed to develop. And as suggested, one must start with an environmental analysis of particular needs and sociological background of the Philippines in 1988. Let us then begin. It has been 2 years since the Aquino government has assumed the reins of our nation. As our secretary has so well summarized, much has of course been done, and yet even more remains to be done. The complexity and multiplicity of the problems that continue to beset our nation are enormous, and just as enormous has been our seeming inability to harness the vast resources and individual talent at our disposal to bring quick, concerted, effective solutions to these problems. By its own admission, the overriding concern and